Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neal Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. I am happy to be back with a guest this week. I'm speaking to National Master Anthony Levin, fellow New York chess player, and the news manager at chess.com. So, Anthony, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me on, Neal.
Absolutely. So, you're a fellow New York guy. You went to Stony Brook University right here on the island. And I'd love to hear about that. And also, I know you played chess at a Panera Bread. And interestingly enough, there was another Neal who ran it, spelled his name the same way that I do with the A, but it wasn't me. You thought it might have been me. But maybe just tell us a little bit about that, your Stony Brook experience and playing Blitz there, what that was like on the island.
Sure. Let me start a little bit earlier because actually I got into chess at a very late age compared to some of the other stories that you hear. I mean, for example, nowadays, if you get into chess at the age of 11 or 12, that's considered to be very late. I mean, we have grandmasters at the age of 12. So I started chess at the age of 18. And it was really just a friend in high school invited me to the park. And he had a chessboard, and I 4-move checkmated him. And we played a few more other games. And then I went home and typed chess into YouTube and somehow just fell down the rabbit hole. And I'm still going down the same rabbit hole over 10 years later. But I started in my senior year of high school. And so I played my first tournament at the age of 19. I think it's around after my first year of college. And so most of my time learning about chess and exploring chess happened in college. And it was a very good time for exploration because I just had all the time in the world. I had my studies, of course, too, but I had more time than for example, I have now as an adult. So most of it was played online. And that's something that in my generation, I think we're so lucky to have, that you can, if you want to play a Blitz game, you could do it on your phone. I think we have access to playing games more than there's ever been before. And so I was also part of the Stony Brook chess club. At some point, I was the vice president of it. And there was also a local get together. There was another guy named Neal, and unfortunately, I don't remember his last name, and I haven't kept in contact with him. But he organized a Blitz event every single Thursday. It was either Wednesday or Thursday near my campus, and so I remember going over and playing. I was always the youngest person there, but it gave me a lot of experience. And the people weren't very high rated, but it gave me a lot of experience of playing like that in-person connection. That for my first year of playing chess, that was one of the very few instances that I had an in-person connection with people before I played in tournaments that you just can't get online.
Absolutely. Now, you're living in Brooklyn now, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So you don't know Alex Lenderman by any chance, do you?
I do.
Okay. I was going to say, he's a great guy. He's a Brooklyn guy too. Do you guys like hang or you just kind of know him?
We've known each other for a while. And actually the funny thing is he probably doesn't remember the first time we met, but I do. It was maybe my first or second year of playing chess. And he had just released a video course on the Smith-Morra Gambit on ICC. And he was IM Alex Lenderman back then. And I remember he was walking out of a tournament hall and I recognized him and I was like, oh my God, you're Alex Lenderman. And he's like, yeah, that's me. And I fanboyed really hard and he was confused. But later on, he basically recognized me because we were in a lot of tournaments together. And recently we played a game and we talked for a long time afterwards. And so I wouldn't call us best friends, but I would say we're on friendly terms.
All right, that's cool. Yeah, he's a great guy. Like, he's just one of the guys, like, there's no ego. He doesn't walk around like puffing his chest. Just a fantastic person. We had him on the podcast a few episodes back, but I heard Brooklyn. That's what kind of came into my head. So now you're also a fellow, or were a fellow school teacher. You had taught English and chess in the New York schools for about 5 years or so. So what was that like, teaching English? Like, how did you get into that, and what was that all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I got into chess, it was never intended to be part of my career. It was sort of a game that I played on the side. And when I went to Stony Brook University, I was an English major. Basically, from my junior year of high school, I knew that I wanted to teach English. I had really inspirational teachers who changed my life, and I wanted to do that for others. And so the plan was always finish high school, finish college, teach English, and that's what I just wanted to do for my whole career. So I taught English full time after college. I was teaching in the Bronx, and chess was always a part of my life, but it wasn't part of my professional career. So I found it. They didn't have a chess club, and I started it. It was a very casual thing. We never traveled to tournaments, but kids did come and play once a week. We had some internal tournaments, but this is very there was never any USCF ratings. And after 3 years, I don't know. I've always been kind of restless. I'm still pretty young, so my career is not super long, but I've always kind of wanted more. Or after 3 years, I just wanted to move on from that job, and suddenly chess became much more a part of my career. So I left the public school in the Bronx, and I actually became a full-time chess teacher in another area of the Bronx for Success Academy. And many listeners have probably heard of Success Academy because they have quite a reputation for having very serious chess teams. And I mean, I was surprised that I taught a chess class with grades. So, I mean, I was grading kids. I had four classes that were for your beginner players. To a large extent, just learning how the pieces move. But I had one class that was the team, and those kids came to school early to play chess, to practice. And we traveled to tournaments. I went as far as Florida for nationals. So I did that for 2 years. And then COVID hit. And to be honest, I was pretty happy with the way my career was going. I was pretty happy there. And then for myself, as well as a lot of other people, just COVID spun my universe around. And what happened for me was that, I wasn't prepared to move on. But COVID made me realize once again that I needed another shift. And to be honest, one of the things that shifted for me was that I was really comfortable working from home, and I didn't want to come back to an in-person thing. I taught online for a full year, and it was so comfortable. And then I just couldn't see myself coming back anymore. And next thing you know, I applied to several opportunities, and I got this job at chess.com. And chess.com was the first time where I could combine my passion for writing and literature in English and my love for chess, which until then had always been separate. It was always either teaching English or either teaching chess. And this is the first time where I get to write about chess, which for me feels like I do the two things I'm really good at that have always been separated in my life.
That leads me right into my next question, because I wanted to ask you about your role as news manager. Two-part question. First, I'm just curious if you can, I don't know how much you can say, how you got the position, maybe the application process. I'm just curious about that. And then what your responsibilities look like as news manager.
Sure. I mean, a lot of it was, I personally consider it circumstance. The job that I was interested in happened to just be posted on chess.com/jobs. If you go there at any time, chess.com/jobs, there's always some sort of jobs listed. I will say the majority of them, there's always a lot of like programming/back end jobs offered. And for content writing, less so. So sometimes you'll check and I think there's always at least one job offered. But when I check that page, and I just happen to check it because chess.com is maybe the first thing you look if you're looking for chess jobs. When I happened to look for it, it had the position of events correspondent, which is how I started, and then I moved up. Basically, what I do at chess.com is write news articles as well as educational articles. So that means like covering news reports for big tournaments. Probably the last big tournament that I wrote about that was over the board was the WR Masters in Dusseldorf, Germany. I also cover a lot of the big online events like the Champions Chess Tour, but I also edit, I would say, the majority of news reports. So if you read chess.com news, there by any author, there's a good chance that I played a role in it before it came out. I also do social media. So if you are watching an event live and you're on Twitter and you go to chess.com live, the posts coming out of there are most likely coming from me. And I do a lot of other like written content all over the place. It's kind of more scattered in other areas, but it's a lot of writing. And like I said, it's what I really love to do and kind of what I've been waiting to do for a long time. And I wish honestly that I found this earlier in my life, but I'm happy that I'm here now.
I was going to say it's still pretty early. I mean, how old are you? Can I ask your age? Is that all right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm turning 30 in a week.
Oh, you're a young pup. Yeah. What did I had, who was on here? My friend, Nick Figueredo. He was only like 26. So I was joking with him. I'm like, we'll get you a nap in a juice box. No, you're a young pup. All right. No, that's great though. That's awesome. And that's strictly a remote position, right?
Yeah. So everything happens from home, which is, like I said, it's kind of, in many ways, it's the kind of thing I've been waiting for.
Yeah, no, a lot of people did that. A lot of people basically said to their bosses, I'm not coming back, or let's do a hybrid, or let's work it out. Or in some cases, if you were kind of working freelance, you could just sort of do it. But it's like you said, COVID changed the landscape all the way. I mean, I remember when Zoom first came out, everyone thought it was really weird. And, I was showing my face on camera. Now it's like, it's like every day. It's Tuesday, whatever. It's amazing how all the changes are now just mainstream. I want to ask you one other thing. You have an interest in writing about sort of less popular or less well-known chess figures. In other words, not so much super GMs or these kids, but sort of less known players, but who've made an impact on the game. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in chess, it's really nice to hear about the best players in the world, and we hear a lot about them. I could just like run through the list. It's like Magnus, Hikaru, Caruana, Wesley. So you don't have to follow chess for a very long time. And I know this from experience when I was 19, before you realize that the names of the top 10 are repeated over and over again. And so it's like you learn their names pretty quickly, but you also don't learn the names of players outside of that until you do some deep digging. And I think obviously it's important to follow the top players because they're the best that there is. But there's like an overwhelming focus on that, and something that when I interviewed for the position, actually with chess.com, I talked about. I do want to write about players who are less in the limelight. And so, I mean, it gets pretty localized. Recently, I wrote about Juan Senna. He's a national master from New York, and I wrote an article, a blog post about how he's struggling with ALS. He was diagnosed with it in, I think, 2019, and he's in a rehabilitation center. And I just wrote about his his history with chess, his relationship with it, and he's like a very interesting person to read about, and not because he's a grandmaster, but it's also very chessy and it's fascinating. I also wrote about. I keep an eye on kids who are earning norms. So Tani Adewumi, I think everybody who's into chess in New York has probably heard his name. In fact, he might be a little more mainstream now than he was before. But I'm always on Tani watch if he's ever at a tournament, earning his. He's working towards his last IM norm and the 2400 rating. I'm always watching, and I'm always. In fact, I have an article prepared for when he already achieves the IM title. I have my eye on a few other players. I mean, Megan Paragua is maybe one who is less known, but she's super impressive. She's, of course, a relative of V. Mark Paragua, who's a grandmaster. But there's a lot of young players in New York and older players who kind of deserve more attention. And maybe this comes from a place of like I think as a late starter myself, and there's other people like me that people never hear about, like the people who got into chess at 18 or 19, and I probably will never reach the grandmaster title because you do have to start at an early age for that. But the story is worth listening to anyway, and so I look for these stories of players who in many cases are very well known in their own circles. Like people in the Marshall Chess Club will know who they are, and everybody's known them for decades. But nobody outside of New York has ever heard of them. And many of these people have stories that deserve to be told. For example, actually, let me just circle back to Jay Bonin. Is a huge name for New Yorkers, and people in the U.S. know him. But I brought up his name to people from Europe or Asia, and there's people who have never heard of him in Europe. And I think that he's a super accomplished player. I think his favorite win is he beat how am I blanking on this? He beat Reshevsky, Sammy Reshevsky, on his birthday. I think it was his 28th birthday. And so I'm like, dude, he's an IM. He beat Reshevsky. He has a lot of other great wins over grandmasters, and he's got to be the most prolific player of chess, definitely in the United States. But I think he has to be in like FIDE also of all time. And so he's kind of a name who I think should be recognized worldwide. And I've already talked to him about an article that I can work on with him as well.
Oh, that's awesome, because Jay's a friend. He's been on the podcast. He was on maybe 4 or 5 episodes back. Actually, it was the season finale of last season. I don't know, maybe 7 episodes back. Great guy, fascinating guy, and he's a friend. Yeah, he's actually residing at a care facility right here on Long Island. But good person. But that's awesome. I'm glad you're going to be doing something with Jay. Really, really great guy. Fascinating story. So let's change gears a little bit. There's talk of this quote unquote phase out of classical chess and classical time controls, and how online chess is sort of taking over, and you have this big chess boom and speed chess. I mean, I know I have my opinion. I'm just curious, what's your thought on this whole thing that classical chess is being quote unquote threatened, and that whole thing versus online chess? Just curious what your take is on that scene.
Yeah. So I wrote an article called "Is Classical Chess Being Phased Out?" Question mark. And it's a pretty provocative title. And it's, at least when I wrote it, it was kind of a question that I saw kept boiling up across social media and various articles. It was just a topic of conversation, probably spurred by the fact that Magnus was talking about. I think actually the phrase "phase out" was a quote from Magnus, and he forgetting the timeline of things, but at some point he said that he thinks classical chess will be phased out. At least, and then he added, at least I think it should be. And so then a lot of people are talking about this, and I wrote an article about it, and I was just curious about what like numbers say. Like are viewership numbers going down for classical chess? Are they higher in speed chess online? Is there more prize money offered online in classical? So I took a look at some numbers. Obviously, I wrote the article in about a week, so I could have done like much deeper research, and I'm sure that more can be done, and more evidence can be presented. I think at the end of the day, they don't even really have to be in competition with each other. What I'm seeing is that they're both growing, and online chess is growing very fast, and it's kind of like the sexy thing nowadays. It started to come onto the stage really hard in 2020 when classical chess was shut down because of COVID, and so everybody went online, and suddenly all this money got poured into prize money online, and now you have things like the Champions Chess Tour, where $2 million are offered as prize money throughout the whole year for this giant event. But so in 2020, obviously, speed chess gave more prize money than classical chess because there was no classical chess being offered. But if you go to 2022, classical chess kind of makes a comeback. I don't actually remember off the top of my head which one offered more money. I think it might have been speed chess, but if anything, it was not nearly like a very large margin. And what you're seeing with viewership numbers is that, for example, the World Championship is still the most viewed of classical chess, is still the most viewed event of the year, and by like a huge margin.
Yes.
There's no comparison with anything online. At least for the Nepo Ding one in 2021, that was huge. A big question, and I mentioned this in our article, was what will it be like for this World Championship? And because Magnus Carlsen isn't participating, and it's very interesting because I think I heard a lot of pessimism about this World Championship. A lot of like, okay, if Magnus isn't participating, nobody cares. But you and I are talking now. Just 2 hours ago, Ding won the 4th decisive game out of 6 games. I've been doing a little digging. I can't find another World Championship where there's been this many wins in the first 6 games.
I know, it's crazy, right? I was expecting like draw. And even when early on, they each got a win, you had each of them had to decide. I know nobody, I think, really expected that.
Yeah. So I can't definitively say this is a record breaker, but it feels like it. Topalov Kramnik in 2006 had a lot of decisive games, but I haven't looked at the exact numbers yet. But like, and I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. I think the way they've set this up in the first stage is just going to keep going.
Yeah, it's a tennis match.
Yeah, so I mean, I think even though the world champion isn't participating, I think the way this is going right now is definitely promising. So I don't see classical chess like I find it very hard to believe in 2 years that say that people will not be playing classical chess. I don't see why people like Fabiano Caruana, for example, can't play classical chess and then in between tournaments also play online. So I do. A big question for me is how much is classical chess really declining, and how much is this due to a narrative that people are building? I think there's a huge narrative around like people don't care about classical anymore. Online is the only thing we care about, and it's something that's getting repeated. And I don't know how truthful it is.
I agree completely. I agree. I like what you said earlier, that they don't have to compete with each other. You know, they can definitely coexist. And I know, speaking as someone who's active at the club level, most club players, improvers, whatever you want to call them, when they go to their local club, they want to play slower games. In fact, we used to have speed chess tournaments, one of those things where you'd have like a game 10, like 7 rounds in a night, and I wasn't getting the attendance, even though it's a separate rating, even though your regular rating is not at stake. People didn't care. They just don't enjoy it. And even if you do a quote unquote regular rated or classical control, even if it's something like a game 45 or a game 50, that's still too fast for a lot of players. They don't want to do game 45, even if there's a delay. I think the minimum for like a slower, quote unquote, slower club control would be game 75. That's a minimum. I mean, I happen to like game 90. I think that's a good standard. But I know at the club level, again, my point is that a lot of players, a lot of them, they don't like these quicker time controls. So you're definitely going to have that population who's always going to want to play slower.
Yeah, I agree. I think I should make a clarification that I just should say this because I didn't say it earlier, but this conversation that Magnus and other top players are having they're only talking about the very elite of chess. So when Magnus said classical chess is being phased out, he was only talking about for the top 10, 20 people in the world. By the way, I mean, Fabi has also on his podcast C Squared kind of agreed with Magnus. And for people like for those guys, Fabiano is saying, rapid chess promises me a lot of money, less preparation, less work. Why not jump into that? A big question I have is for the club players. How interested are they in watching the top players play speed chess versus classical? And right now, the numbers show that for like the World Championship or even the candidates, the numbers for the last two showed that they're more interested in watching classical chess. But speed chess has only been popular since 2020 in the way that it is now, and so there's time for it to grow.
Yeah, and see, I don't like, this is just my own personal thing. I don't like at the World Championship that if there's a tie break, they need to decide it through speed games. This is just me. I just think that kind of ruins the whole point of, all the games, as long as it takes, should be determined through classical chess, right? Because there was an argument even that, when Magnus won against Karyakin, I believe that was the correct match, that it's almost like he tried to sort of jerry-rig it into the tie breaks because he's such a strong speed chess player. And so the argument is, I'm not saying I necessarily feel this way. I'm sort of playing devil's advocate. The argument is, well, is that really legit that he won it through speed chess, right? I don't know. I understand that it can go on forever and ever and they have to have a tie break, but using quick games at the World Championship, it just doesn't sit right with me. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So I don't want to give a direct opinion because I do go back and forth. I think about this a lot. And so at the moment, I don't have this is the right way. But there's merit to what you're saying. And I think a solution that is worth considering is that if the World Championship is drawn or tied at the end, that the World Champion stays on. It used to be this way, that the challenger, it's on the challenger to show that he's better. And so if it's tied, the world champion stays on, and you try again next time. And I'm not saying that's the solution, but I'm saying if we wanted to get rid of rapid and blitz, that's a way to just solve it without having Kasparov Karpov 1984, where they just play indefinitely. And B, it also puts more onus on one of the players to take risks. So
I like that suggestion. Yeah,
it might even produce more decisive games. If not in the beginning, then if they're tied, there's going to be desperation at the end. In a way that's not that kind of desperation doesn't exist with the current format.
Yeah, no, that's legit. If it's tied, like he keeps the crown, something like that. No, that's a valid suggestion. All right, so let's turn to some chess improvement talk, because I know you have some thoughts about that regarding your own journey and some tips. So I'm going to kind of set this up, Anthony, and I'll let you run with it. So I was hoping you could share some thoughts and insight on your own improvement journey. I know you have some thoughts on how adults can make progress even when they're busy with school or work and staying motivated, anything like that. So feel free to run with it.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that it takes a lot more discipline for people starting late than it does for people starting early, especially because you have less time and you often have fewer resources. So one of the challenges is like I paid out of pocket for my first tournament. I know that there's a lot of like if you're growing up in Scholastic, there's a lot of like free tournaments for kids. Chess in the Schools does a fantastic job of providing these kinds of tournaments, but there's no equivalent for somebody in their first year of college who never played as a child. My first tournament was it doesn't exist anymore, but it was the New Yorker tournament. It was in 2019, and it was organized by CCA, and so I had to pay $100 entry fee to play in this tournament. And at the time, $100 for me was like a good amount of my life savings. And I could see in many cases, even that in itself dissuading people from getting to tournament play. Maybe I'll just play rapid chess on chess.com for a few more years. And so there's like a huge incentive for kids to start playing. Also, kids have access to coaches. I did have a coach, but I paid $30 an hour. It was a pretty cheap coach when I started. But there's a lot less support for people who are older. And therefore, I think it's a lot harder and a lot easier to get discouraged, to improve less fast, and to kind of like not see your place in the game, because the way it's structured right now, it's really going against adult learners. And so I do have to say that like once you are into it, and if you stay motivated and you do make some sacrifices, for example, that $100 for me was a sacrifice. The benefits that you see, and like the love of the game, that thrill of winning a game in a tournament which cannot be replaced with online. It's like one of the greatest highs in my life. It's why I keep coming back. But I would just say, for me, one of the things that I found I had to work very hard at was internalizing patterns that weren't internalized as a kid. Because if you're like 8 years old, your brain is a sponge. You solve 1,000 chess puzzles. You memorize those puzzles for life. They just stick with you forever. When you try to do the same thing, you solve those 1,000 puzzles, but you're 22 years old. It kind of goes in one ear and it comes out the other. It's kind of, you're less of a sponge and it's more elusive. And so instead of solving 1,000 puzzles, you have to solve 5,000 puzzles, 10,000 puzzles. And so it requires more work. But I think there's a belief that, or from what I hear, like from other adults, there's this belief that because it's not as easy, that it's not achievable. And that's totally not true. I just think it takes more work. And those patterns can totally be instilled. I mean, for me, Puzzle Rush is huge because it's those like really basic mating patterns. I drill them like a million times. And I think they're as embedded in my brain as they are for any 10-year-old.
Okay, so let me jump in. I'm sorry to interrupt. So Puzzle Rush for you, in other words, it's not so much entertainment or warm-up. You feel that Puzzle Rush is legitimately helping you with pattern recognition.
Absolutely, yeah, and exactly with pattern recognition. So it helps me with subconscious pattern recognition. There's there's like two levels of calculation. There's one where you just subconsciously, your brain just immediately sees the mate without having to think at all. And then there's like the more complex ones, where it takes you actually have to like run through the moves in your head and consider different branches. Puzzle Rush for me helps train that first part, and it's super basic, and it's like a low level of calculation, but it's also very important. For example, when you like sack a piece for an attack and you can't calculate all the lines, that's where that kind of innate pattern recognition comes in handy, because that's what we call like feeling the attack, or they say like in the spirit of the position. There's these things where you might not even have the actual line, but you know that it works. Of course, after that you calculate also, but that intuition is it helps a lot with chess, because in chess you really can't calculate everything. You can't see everything.
Yeah, it helps the light go on. In other words,
yes,
bishop takes h7 check. I can't see it through, but I know it's there. I know it's there. Like, go find it, that type of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and how often do you do Puzzle Rush? Like every day?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if I say every day, people are going to go to my account and fact check it. So,
no, I'm not grilling you. I'm trying to just get into your like practical study plan. But it's something you do on a regular basis.
I do it very regular, and I would say very close to every day. Especially because it takes 5-10 minutes. So if I want to procrastinate work, I find it more useful to do one Puzzle Rush than it is to play a 3-minute blitz game, and it takes about the same amount of time.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, please continue. I kind of jumped in with the Puzzle Rush. So you were talking about your improvement and your own journey and adults who start late. So
yeah, I guess one thing I'll also point out is it's super important, and I say this to children too. So this is kind of for any learner. Super important to set small, achievable goals. So a problem for me in college was that my goal was to become FM. And it's like when you set that goal and you haven't played a tournament yet, it's very discouraging when you realize how hard it is to reach there. But small, achievable goals, for me, during the pandemic, I had all this time that I used to not have. And my small, achievable goal was to do puzzles every single day. Like never skip one, even if it's only one puzzle. And I was posting on Facebook about this, but I reached 400 something days of never missing a puzzle. Some days I was on vacation, so I'm like in another country. I don't have time. I did a lot of those days just solve one puzzle, but the goal was one puzzle every day. Your goal might be, reach the rating of 1,000 in the next 2 or 3 months, but they should be things that you can check in with yourself on in a short amount of time. If you set a yearly goal, there's a lot of time that goes by, and what happens if you haven't reached it yet? So, I mean, I could comment on my goals right now are 2 Dvoretsky puzzles every day, and sorry, I'm blanking. I wrote this down somewhere. The Dvoretsky puzzle came to mind right away because I solved one before getting on here. Oh, and then some serious opening study, because I have some openings that I have some holes in. So it's about 1 to 2 hours of opening studying specific lines. And the goal is in 2 months, I'm going to be playing these new openings. And depending on what happens to my rating, I'll know whether I succeeded or not.
Right. Can I ask what they are, or is this top secret? I don't want you to give away the,
Yeah. I will say, so I don't want to say what they are because I'm really changing my repertoire.
Okay.
But yeah, that's what I will say is that almost all my openings will be different. And I haven't played since December, and I've been working on like a very new style chess. But specifically because I was one of those people who was very predictable, like your Peter Svidler or Bashir Lagrave, like everybody knows you played the Grunfeld. And it was getting annoying because people were preparing for me to a very high level. I was just getting crushed in the opening. And so that's also why I don't want to say what the opening is.
Okay. I was going to ask you, because my whole thing is, because I agree. I tell beginners, like, find a repertoire that works for you and just stick with it. So that way you can spend. So I was going to ask you why you're changing it, but you answered it. So basically, you're tired of people just knowing what you play and prepping against it. So you're looking for a complete overhaul.
Absolutely. And one of the things that unfortunately, nobody has to think about this when they're at the club level. And I wouldn't change anything, but I was not very conscious of hiding my games or being secretive about my games when I was like when I was not playing in open sections. So my games are all out there online and people can study them. And I never really changed that much. So I'm still playing the same lines and the same openings, but it's different. It never affected me until recently, where, if I'm playing an FM, IM, or GM, they will actually take a look at all those games and they'll prepare something on like move 11 or 12. And they specifically hit me in the pain points that are the most painful. And actually, the reason why I stopped playing in December was because I basically lost with white just out of the opening. The game barely lasted 20 moves. And it was because it was one of these lines that I told myself I would study, and then I never did. And this guy found that weakness. And that's why I stopped. And I was going to say, I'm going to restructure everything so that this doesn't happen again.
And that's the thing with the titled players and the strong players. You have the slightest little vulnerability in your game, they're going to find it. They're going to find it. And at the club level, you can probably get away with that more. But it's like you said, you're not going to fool them.
Yeah, you really don't have to worry about this at the club level, because even if they prepare something and get an opening advantage, the opening advantage might not stick. And I mean, to be honest, might not stick at a lot of levels, but it's annoying when you're playing a strong. He was higher rated than me, so it is annoying when you're playing somebody higher rated and they already have an opening advantage against you.
Yeah, sure. Right. Now, let me ask this much. Are you an E4 guy? You strike me as an E4 guy.
So this is very funny.
All right, you don't have to answer that.
I will say that I started as an E4 player.
Okay.
And then when I switched to D4, it wasn't the reason why I broke 2000, but it got a lot easier for me to break 2000. And since then, I've been playing a lot of different first moves.
Okay. All right. Interesting. I'm curious where this would lead. Well, good luck with it, because that's overhauling your openings. That's like, for me, I mean, that's like a big deal. I think for any player, that's a big deal, because there's probably going to be some bumps along the way as you recalibrate, probably take some tough losses, because a lot of people, myself included, admittedly, they're not going to really want to change openings that they've been playing for a long time. See, for me, everybody knows what I'm going to play pretty much, but it's like you said, at the club level, probably doesn't make much of a difference. I'd rather them know what I'm going to play, but I'm comfortable in the position, than try to mix it up so that I can get around your prep, but then I don't know what the hell I'm doing. You know what I mean? That type of thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and this is, of course, why it's been since December. This is why I'm taking about 5 or 6 months, because I do plan on playing this stuff against people who are better than me. And you're absolutely right. A while ago, I picked up the Sicilian Najdorf. This is like many years ago. For me, that used to be a new opening. Now everybody knows about Najdorf player.
Yeah.
So
well, yeah. Sharp stuff.
Yeah. So I played that when I first picked it up. I remember I was just like getting my butt whooped for half a year. I was getting destroyed by people low rated than me, because it's one of those openings that if you don't know the lines, it's not good. But once I got the feeling for the opening, and it kind of comes back to this subconscious thing, like you feel the moves, then it became very dangerous. But it takes a while to get there, and that's why I wouldn't recommend people switch up their openings unless they have a very good reason.
Right. I mean, what I tell beginners, like, this is my philosophy, I'm curious what you think of it, and I've mentioned this in other episodes. If you are, regardless of what color, black or white, if you're getting middle games on a regular basis where you're equal, slightly better, or much better, then you're using a good opening. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, yeah, if you're not running into issues, you definitely shouldn't change that much. And to be honest, even if you are running into issues, the answer is not a new opening. Most of the time, the answer is learn your opening better.
Right.
It's a lot easier.
Very well said. I agree. Yeah. So as far as tactics, I just want to kind of pick your brain about improvement and your study plan. You mentioned Puzzle Rush. Are there any other things you use for tactics? Is it puzzles? Are there any books you use? Just curious.
Yeah. So when I did my 400 something days, the app that I used was chesstempo.com. The reason I love that one is because it gives you a little fire symbol with a streak. So if you do 2 days in a row, there's a little fire symbol and it says 2. I think chess.com might have that too, but I just wasn't familiar with it at the time. And so for me, that was the big motivation to keep going. Just that little thing that told me how often. So Chess Tempo is huge. I also really like the quality of puzzles on Chess Tempo. Right now, I solve chess.com puzzles to a large extent. It's been in increments of 100 point rating gains. So I was 3,400, which is like a crazy inflated rating. I was 3,400 in December, and I just broke 3,500 like a week ago. So I do those pretty regularly, but it's not an everyday thing. Dvoretsky puzzles. Right now, I'm doing the book. I think it's called "Spotting Your Opponent's Resources," because I noticed a big problem in my game was not seeing a very good move from my opponent, and I'm talking about like double exclam moves. So it's hard enough finding them for yourself. I mean, a double exclam for anybody is very difficult, but seeing it for your opponent is tough. And I've lost so many games because their move wasn't even on my radar. It's like, it's not even that I misevaluated, it's that when they played it, I was just like, I didn't even consider it. And so I do think that was a weakness that I've been also like tackling specifically with this book since December. The hard thing for me with books is that, okay, so online on chess.com, there's a number that tells me, it goes up and it tells me if I'm getting better. So I know that I'm getting better, at least with chess.com puzzles, because I've risen 100 points. With books, I don't know how much these Dvoretsky puzzles have helped me until I play games and maybe my rating goes up. But I think it's a lot. I love books, and I think the quality of puzzles in books is something unmatched by online, and also the explanations in books. But it's very hard for me to sense how much I'm improving from a book, which I think it just takes longer to see the fruits of your labor.
I have to check that out. So it was spotting your opponent's resources. Is that what it was? Okay.
Yeah, definitely the word resources is in the title.
All right, I'll find it. I'll put a link for it, or you can email me. So no, it sounds interesting. I like the title alone is kind of selling me, because it's like you said, there's nothing more frustrating than spending time analyzing a position and thinking, and then your opponent plays a move, and it's not so much that he played the move, but it's like you said, the frustration is that you didn't even consider it.
Yeah, and by the way, one thing I really love about this book is that it's actually, for a pretty strong player, it's actually solvable. I've done like Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, and those puzzles I could solve like 5% maybe.
I was just laughing. That's supposed to be like the most brutal like Endgame book out there, right?
Yeah, you try to solve it's so disheartening because you just can't solve anything, and you honestly you can't even come up with candidate moves. So one thing about this is it is really hard, and I'll say maybe for 2,000 plus is where I would put it.
Okay.
But it is like solvable, and every single puzzle is about finding your opponent's moves. And it's so different from anything I've done before. I will also mention, by the way, one more book, Perfect Your Chess. I think Volokitin was one of the writers. That is the best puzzle book I've ever done.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put links for all of these books that Anthony mentions. Some of these I didn't even hear of, so I'm very curious to check them out. We'll put links for Anthony's articles as well. and all his chess.com info. So, Anthony, can you talk to me a little bit about end games as far as what you think most improvers need? It's a very controversial part of the game as far as studying, like what you need to know. There are people who say, which I don't agree with, if there's only one phase of the game, you're going to study the end game. There are those who say that a lot of end game study is overblown at the amateur level. Curious what your thoughts are, both for your own progress and for most improvers out there.
Yeah, great question. Endgame is super important, but when we talk about endgames, I think it's important to distinguish like what level the player is. Because, for example, with my students, with beginners, I always start with the endgame because I'm teaching them queen versus king checkmate. I mean, that's the endgame. Rook versus king checkmate. Even towards like more advanced beginners, I always start with how to win with just one pawn, with opposition. How to draw some of the very basic ones with stalemate. So I always start with the end game, and that is the end game. But I think when you're talking about more advanced players, you're talking about something much more complicated. I will mention a book again. So I know everybody points to Jeremy Silman's Endgame book as like the holy grail of endgame for, I guess, intermediate or above players. To be honest, I haven't read it, but everybody talks so highly of it that I should probably check it out at some point. For me, the equivalent, like the holy grail for me personally, was Shereshevsky's Endgame manual. No, it's called Strategy in the Endgame by Shereshevsky. And it's also just kind of that. It walks you through kind of all the basic stuff you need to know for the endgame. And I think until you reach a very high level, the basics are pretty much good enough. And all the complex stuff you actually, at least in my case, I learned from practical things that happen in my game. So, for example, some very complex rook endgames, I would never have, even if I studied it in a book, I wouldn't have remembered it. But if I lost a game over the board in this rook endgame that the computer says is a draw, I will spend days learning how I should have drawn that, and I will never lose it again.
Yeah, you got to play through it. Yep. Okay, yeah. Very interesting. I like what you said. The basics for most people, that's what you need, and then the other stuff you'll kind of add it.
Absolutely, and we're talking about like for sure untitled players. Of course, when you're at the IM or GM level, you kind of just need to know everything. But I think you learn a lot from practical play, and you also, I feel it's a better allocation of your time because you're studying things that are actually appearing in your games. For example, I've never had in my life had the bishop and rook versus rook endgame for either side, and I've kind of studied it. So I studied it every few years, but I forget about it because I never use it. And so I don't think it's very useful for me to spend hours studying this. The knight and bishop mate, for example, I've actually had this a few times, never over the board, but online I get it. I've studied it, and I could probably do it pretty confidently, but it's one of those that I do wonder. I think someone told me that Jeremy Silman doesn't even go over it in his book because it's so impractical. I haven't read it, so I can't verify that, but there's some value in, like, if it's never going to appear in your game, how useful is it to study it? The way I approach it is I spent about probably 6 hours on it overall, like ever, and that's kind of all the time I'll ever use on it. But there's so much to study in chess, and there's so much to know, and a big part of it is allocating your time in the most useful way.
I agree with what you said. I was actually going to say this, and you beat me to it. There are so many endgame positions, bishop and knight mate, Lucena, Philidor, where you study it, but you then forget about it. And then by the time it comes up, because I think that's what happens with a lot of those positions with endgames. You study it, I know it, you did it in the lesson, but if you don't review it on a regular basis, by the time it shows up, you almost forget about it. I think that's a very, very important point because that's what happens. If you don't use it on a regular basis, it's not going to be imprinted in your brain.
Yeah. I will say something that's kind of contradictory though, because I did also I also like went through Gretzky's Endgame Manual, the whole thing, when I was around 2000, and that's
wow,
and that's doing more than the basics.
Wow,
so
that's no small feat.
Yeah, well, I will say that I didn't solve the puzzles. So I read through all the text and all the explanations, but I didn't do the quizzes at the end.
Okay. Okay.
Because I was just going to get 0% right. So eventually, like, I started going through it the second time and actually solving the puzzles, and I was actually getting some of the King Pawn Endgame puzzles right. But so I probably did more than just the basics, and there are definitely things that helped me. For example, I was able to draw Rook and King versus the F and H endgame, where they have two pawns. They have two pawns. They have F pawn and H pawn. And a rook, and you have a rook and king, and you're able to draw that theoretically. I was able to draw that actually once over the board, but I don't think I needed to study Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. For example, in Smyslov's Endgame Virtuoso book, he just shows you a game where he drew it. He's like, this is how I drew it, and he explains it. And he just shows you one game. And I think that would have been enough. So there's like, I think I took the longer path by studying Dvoretsky, and I could have achieved the same results, especially as a 2000 player. I could have just read Silman's book and Cherishevsky's Endgame book, and that would have helped me get to where I need to be at that level.
Right. Silman's book is good. I have it. I do recommend it. Bruce Pandolfini's Endgame course is also good. It's very simply laid out with puzzles. The only thing with Silman's book, and I'm a huge Silman person though, what he does in his Endgame book, he structures it by rating, which I think people have to be not literal with that, because some of the things he lists that higher rated players should know, I think if you're lower rated, you should know it as well, and vice versa. I think there's some overlapping, but to be fair, I don't think he meant it literally. Like, in other words, if he has an end game for 1,400 players, I don't think he thinks, well, if you're 1,000, you should wait. So as far as the structure, I think there's some interpretation there. But what's great about the Silman book, it literally has everything you need to know. I mean, if you're under 2,000, there's nothing in there that, everything you need to know is in there. You're going to be set for quite some time. But, like you said, there's a lot of other stuff out there and online courses.
What's tricky is it's not even a question of where do I learn this. Like, it's not hard to find resources. The problem nowadays is that there's too many resources. If you Google, chess book on Endgame, especially if you like go on Chessable or something, there's like 20,000 things. So people should also be very careful about, like, you can't read everything, and just ask around, ask players that you respect, ask people that you know what they did, and go by, for me, I go by personal recommendations, because there's just so much material out there, and it's kind of a problem now.
Oh yeah, no, it's overwhelming. But yeah. I like what you said too, because I think this is true for me as well. A lot of it is going to come just from studying your own games, and you see these endings, and because you experienced it yourself and you study it, you learn it, and because you're not going to be able to learn everything at once. And even when you do learn it, you ultimately need to play them in your games to really understand it. But I agree. And then as you play more games little by little, almost like a scaffolding type thing, you learn what you need to learn and find where your mistakes are. All right. So I think that's going to do it. So National Master Anthony Levin, really appreciated some great insight. Really enjoyed hearing your story. Some fantastic advice for chess improvement. Maybe at some point we'll have you back, but I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
And for those of you listening at home, we appreciate it. Have a great day, and I hope you win your next game.